May 19th of 2019 saw the release of the final episode of Game of Thrones, concluding its 8-season run. I will not provide any spoilers in this video, but I will say it did not go out on a high note. On the contrary, not just the final episode, but the entire final season may be among the most disappointing and least satisfying series endings of all time. That is not just the opinion of some loud minority of scorned fans online. Even journalists and reviewers in the mainstream media worldwide are saying this. The cast themselves can barely contain their disappointment.
Have you shot your final scenes yet, and are you happy with how things ended? Yes. She didn't say yes. You didn't say yes.
Best season ever!
I couldn't let you go without asking you a little question about Game of Thrones.
Sure.
If you could describe the season finale of Game of Thrones in one word, how would you describe it?
Disappointing.
Disappointing?
Between the release of the penultimate and the final episode, a Change.org petition demanding Season 8 be remade in its entirety was posted. Before the final episode even aired, it had crossed 1 million signatures. How could Game of Thrones, which since its debut in 2011 had been one of the most popular, addictive TV series of all time, fall from such a height to come to this? The popular answer is that they ran out of books to adapt. But there is more to it than that, because the problem started when there was still plenty source material to go. In this postmortem, I will explore how, even before they ran out of books to adapt, George R.R. Martin's writing style provided challenges for both himself and for the showrunners, and how the decisions made in concluding the series turned disastrous. Before rounding out with what this could mean for future spin-offs, one of which is already filming. Up until recently, Game of Thrones was both creatively and financially one of the greatest success stories in TV history. Showrunners David Benioff and D.B. Weiss deserve credit for that success, but not too much, as the recipe for it was always there, laid out in the original source material. As everyone should be aware, Game of Thrones is based on A Song of Ice and Fire, the series of epic fantasy novels by the American writer George R.R. Martin. The series follows 3 interweaving main stories. That of a dynastic war of usurpers among several families for control of Westeros, visualized by the Iron Throne, the rising threat of the supernatural Others in the north, and the ambition of Daenerys Targaryen, heir to the deposed dynasty, to retake the Iron Throne. Through it all, the author's express intention was to subvert the tropes of the literary fantasy genre by bringing in a new level of realism, randomness, and unpredictability. Martin initially envisioned the entire series as a trilogy, but over the course of writing it, he found that it grew in scope and in scale, and so the series grew from the initially planned 3 novels to 7 novels, only 5 of which have been published to date. Therein was planted the seeds of destruction. As is well known, Benioff and Weiss started adapting A Song of Fire and Ice at the time when only 2/3 of the source material was actually completed. From the onset, everyone knew there would come a day when the series caught up with the novels and thus run out of source material to adapt. This was always a concern. Over the course of Season 6, Benioff and Weiss had run out of source material to adapt. In Seasons 7 and 8, they were exclusively working off of synopses provided to them by Martin, which they were free to either stick with or deviate from however much they saw fit. Although we do not know by how much, we do know that they at the very least in part went their own way, and in retrospect, it would appear that did not work out all that well. However, I maintain that running out of published source material did not have to be the problem it turned out to be. Even in the hypothetical event that every main beat and every unpopular story turn was there in the synopsis Martin provided them with, which wasn't the case, but even if it had been, there was a way to salvage it all. That it wasn't salvaged is, in my opinion, due to them already being headed down the road leading to disaster long before they ran out of source material to adapt. There is wide agreement that Season 8 was a disaster. I'd go so far as to say that each episode of Season 8 was worse than the previous one, meaning that at the time of their respective release, each new episode was the worst episode of the entire series. It is not without reason that so many want to see Season 8 remade. Against that backdrop though, it is easy to forget that the stage for Season 8 was set in Season 7, which is where character development started being rolled back, and the concept of teleportation was introduced to the series. Well, either that, or the whole of Westeros shrunk to the size of a county. But really, both Season 7 and 8 were merely the end result of an unfortunate trajectory which began much earlier. Upon closer examination, I would argue that the rot set in as early as in Season 5. Season 5 is where the series reached the point where Martin started losing his way in the books. Bypassing the issues the author inflicted upon himself in the books would require more from Benioff and Weiss as writers than the previous seasons had done. Because Season 5 is where it became clear that showrunners Benioff and Weiss took a very different approach to writing the series than Martin did when writing the books. In a May 16th article published on Wired, Daniel Silvermint broke down the different approaches taken in writing, which explains the massive difference in what manifests itself on screen in the earlier and in the latter seasons of Game of Thrones. Silvermint distinguishes between two different kinds of writers, plotters and pantsers. Let's explore the difference between the two. Plotters are all about plot first. They create a fairly detailed outline before they commit one single word to the page. Because they have the whole story in their mind, it is usually easier for plotters to deliver tighter narratives and end them in satisfying and meaningful ways that the plot has alluded to and built towards. The downside with plotters is that since the entire story is predetermined, their characters can sometimes come off as stiff, playing out their allocated narrative, acting in accordance with what the plot requires of them. By contrast, pantsers discovers the story as they write it. Pantsers are generally better at coming up with fully fleshed out characters, and they essentially make up the plot as they go along by asking themselves what this fully realized person would do or think next in the dramatic situation the writer has dropped them in. But since the characters are firmly in charge, pantsers are prone to poorly structured and meandering plots, and they can struggle to bring everything together in a satisfying conclusion. According to Silvermint, Martin is a pantser, although he describes himself as a gardener who plants character seeds and then carefully guides their growth. For the first few novels, this worked like a charm, and his approach was a direct reason why the early novels, and the early seasons faithfully adapting them, had the emotional impact that they did. But following the conclusion of the first major arc in the third book, A Storm of Shadows, which was adapted over the course of seasons 3 and 4, George R.R. Martin, the self-described gardener, lost control over his garden. He had planned on doing a 5-year time jump, but he couldn't, not without betraying the characters and the world, so he decided to write his way through those 5 years. Even if little of major significance to the overall story would happen over the course of those 5 years. In fleshing them out, more seeds were sown, more characters were introduced, and many of them started growing in the wrong direction. But given the growth that already had been, the storylines and arcs couldn't be altered or cut without adversely affecting the overall narrative. This way, the whole saga grew and expanded, probably in ways Martin never wanted or planned, but was forced into by virtue of staying true to his own characters and their respective arcs and journeys. Eventually, the book stopped coming. As of the making of this video, it's been 8 years and counting since the release of the 5th novel, and the final 2 still don't even have estimated release dates. It should be noted though, that in the years with no new novel coming out, Martin still found the time to write a bunch of prequels, so the man can obviously still write, not just those elusive 6th and 7th novels that fans actually want. Only now, as the TV series is ending, has Martin claimed writing on the next book is going very well. Take that as you will. That digression aside, it was when Martin started losing control over his own story in the books that Benioff and Weiss tried to rein it in on TV. After reasonably faithful adaptations of the first 3 novels over the course of the first 4 seasons, Benioff and Weiss started truncating the 4th and 5th novels, as well as the outlines of the unpublished 6th and 7th novels already in the 5th season. That is why season 5 is where you as a viewer can feel things being a little off. Benioff and Weiss continue doing so in the 6th season, and the results were decidedly mixed. Silvermint went on to say that after season 6, Benioff and Weiss shifted their focus from telling the unfolding story of an entire world to concluding a particular tale set within it. They gave themselves a fixed endpoint, 2 seasons, 13 episodes to the finale. They knew the endpoint Martin had in mind, and they knew which conflicts had to be resolved, and which action set pieces they had to go through to get there. And so the final 2 seasons were retro-engineered from the ending point, and the characters maneuvered into the positions they needed to be in order to make that happen. In this maneuvering, plot armor was handed out as required, previous arcs were rolled back, and the characters made uncharacteristic decisions whenever the plot required to be furthered in the preordained direction. In other words, the characters whose actions had previously dictated the plot were now suddenly subservient to that plot. Silvermint doesn't assign any blame for this. In his words, keeping a million plates spinning the way Martin did is hard, and for the showrunners, so is setting those plates down without breaking too many. I believe Silvermint's explanation perfectly nails what transpired, which is why I'm repeating it here. However, I would not be quite as quick to absolve Benioff and Weiss of all guilt in the matter. Benioff and Weiss cannot be held accountable for the story spiraling out of Martin's control after the 3rd novel. Martin himself hadn't planned on fleshing out the stories told from there on out until he decided the narrative dictated that he did. So even if Benioff and Weiss had continued to adapt the story as faithfully as they had the previous books, there would still have been a noticeable shift. As such, their decision to begin truncating the material is one that can be justified. How they executed that truncation is of course another matter. Some of their decisions on what to leave out, what to include and how to include it were in some sense questionable and gave them both problems and loose ends later on. This is why the rot set in when they started truncating. Likewise, I believe their decision to determine an absolute endpoint and build towards it is also one that can be justified. But what in no shape, way or form can be justified was the decision to set that absolute ending point just 13 episodes away. By the conclusion of the 6th season, there were a total of 60 episodes of Game of Thrones. 60 episodes in which the emerging key set of characters had evolved, matured, grown, and driven the plot forward. Some storylines had been concluded, but others had just been set up. The end of the 6th season did, in my opinion, not so much signal the beginning of the end, as it signaled a new beginning. There was no way the story told over 60 episodes could be concluded in merely another 13, even if some of those were double episodes. That's nullified by too many of those 13 episodes being pure filler. Game of Thrones didn't need just another 2 seasons of fewer episodes to conclude. If anything, it needed another 4 full-length seasons of 10 episodes each in order to conclude in a satisfying manner. I maintain that if more or less the same basic plot that was told over the course of seasons 7 and 8 as they are, instead had been stretched out over the course of 4 full seasons, we would be having a very different discussion right about now. If a whole season, or 2, or even 3 had been devoted to the others, and to Winter being here, to the building of some relationships, to the tearing down of others, to mounting insanities and shifting loyalties, the same basic plot could have been told without being rushed, and without the characters being betrayed. But instead of putting the overall narrative first, Benioff and Weiss seemed to take shortcuts to rush the story.
While Danny kind of forgot about the Iron Fleet and Euron's forces, they certainly haven't forgotten about her.
Make alterations solely for the purpose of subverting expectations, even if this meant betraying what had previously been set up.
You know, if you've planned your book that the butler did it, and then you read on the internet someone has figured out that the butler did it, and you suddenly change in midstream and it was the chambermaid who did it, then you screw up the whole book, because you get this foreshadowing early on, and you've got these little clues you planted, now they're dead ends, and you have to introduce other clues, and you're retconning. It's a mess.
In so doing, they undid everything that had made the series so endearing and so popular with audiences worldwide. In so doing, they lost the fans who turned on the series. Usually, whenever a previously popular franchise subverts expectations by taking on a radical new direction that undermines what made it popular to begin with, fans revolt, only for the media and punditry to in turn attacking and gaslighting said fans. There has been some of that in this case as well, but not nearly as much as usual. This time, many of these same outlets and journalists that would normally only be too happy to crucify and gaslight actually joined the ranks of the fans they'd otherwise label as toxic. I guess that unlike with Star Trek or Star Wars, these journalists must have been genuine fans of Game of Thrones themselves. Funny how the standard you hold others to go out the window when it hits too close to home. The sad thing about all of this is that the legacy of Game of Thrones will no longer be as one of the greatest series of all time, but that it suffered one of the steepest declines in quality of all time, and it can't even blame it on a change of showrunners like Dexter among others. In the short run, this decline in quality won't affect HBO. The final episodes broke viewership records left and right by virtue of being the final episodes, but now that the entire series is out, and it is well known it dropped so badly in quality, rewatch value will be affected. Fans disappointed by it have no reason to return to the series ever again. I know of some fans that will rip seasons 1 through 7 out of their Blu-ray collection altogether, rather than adding season 8 to it, and you can forget all about upgrading to ultra high def. That's a whole lot of Blu-ray releases and box sets that will no longer be sold to paying collectors right there. Furthermore, those who waited for the whole thing to conclude before investing, as well as future audiences that were too young to see it upon release, will all know that Game of Thrones will drop the ball pretty badly by the end, so why invest the time in it? And all of this because Benioff and Weiss decided to rush an end in just 2 shortened seasons, rather than spread it out over multiple full-length seasons. That of course begs the question, why they would do such a thing in the first place. I'm sure HBO would have been more than happy to greenlight additional seasons if Benioff and Weiss had argued that was necessary. I mean, HBO is so enthralled with Game of Thrones and the success it has given them that they have no less than 3 different Game of Thrones prequel series in various stages of development, one of which is already filming, under the working title Blood Moon. What will happen to those now? How many will care about the prequels now when the main story has not only ended, but ended in such an underwhelming a fashion? Caprica comes to mind. In case you haven't heard of that, and you probably haven't, Caprica was a prequel to the hugely popular Battlestar Galactica reboot series. No one cared, and it was cancelled before the first season finished airing, and Battlestar Galactica never dropped the ball quite as badly as Game of Thrones did. Regardless of what drove them to conclude the series in just 13 episodes, Benioff and Weiss blew it in the final quarter, and that is a crying shame. Let me know what you thought about Game of Thrones' final season, how you think it will be remembered, and what you think the future holds for the franchise in the comments.
If you like this video, then please help share it and share your opinion in the comments. Midnight's Edge aims to give the most comprehensive analysis and commentary on genre culture and entertainment. If you would like to see more of our videos, then please subscribe, hit the bell icon, and remember to indicate that you would like to be notified when new videos are uploaded. If you really like what we do, then please support us on Patreon until a better alternative comes along. or send us a direct donation through PayPal. Also, check out our sister channel Midnight's Edge After Dark for live shows and other rants. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and stay tuned for more here at Midnight's Edge.